It's nice to be here with all of you. I'm here from Detroit, Michigan. I teach at the School of Information Sciences at Wayne State University. So today I'm going to present on two projects that I've worked on. The first one is a project I worked on several years ago, where I visualized a segment of the collection from the Henry Ford Museum, which is located in Dearborn, Michigan, which was developed out of the collection of Henry Ford, he of the Ford Motor Company fame. So it's very similar in foundation and scope as the museum that we actually visited yesterday, which is pretty interesting. All right, let me get my slides up here. Okay. All right, go. All right, so since one's approach to a topic has implications, I'll tell you that I teach, as I said, in the School of Information Sciences. I teach in the area of metadata, digital libraries, and digital preservation. In my quest to find good examples of descriptive practices to show students, I came across a blog post by Mia Ridge, who examined the object records belonging to the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. In her post, which discussed the challenges she faced in trying to examine the data, it really brought home the issue of how critical, structured, and standardized descriptive data can be. Additionally, on a more theoretical level, it has to be acknowledged that GLAM data is largely underutilized. Single records might be examined by staff, scholars, and the general public, but there are many additional ways this data can and should be used. Because GLAMs spend a great deal of time, energy, and resources producing, manipulating, preserving, and transforming this data, the expectation should be that we do lots more than single record displays. Beyond this, my research interests fall within the visual realm and cultural heritage materials. I'm interested in visual information in all of its forms and uses. This project was an offshoot of these interests. I wanted to find out what could be done with the data, what's involved in the work in visualizing that data, and what tools were out there to create the visualizations. Oh, I'm sorry. Forget I have to go between the two screens. So I'm just showing you some images of items that are from the Henry Ford. The top is McDonald's, the middle is the bus that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She's a civil rights activist in the United States. In 1955, she refused to give up her seat. She was African American. So that bus is there. And then obviously there are oodles and oodles of cars at the museum because of Henry Ford's interests. I thought it would be good to begin with a screenshot of the Henry Ford's collections page to illustrate the design. This is a fairly standard means of presenting collection data in museums. The objects in the collection are described and displayed singly. This is wonderful for those folks looking for particular items, but not so useful if you're trying to get a sense of what the institution is all about and the collections that it has. This is where visualizations can be helpful since they provide a higher level view onto the collection. I was given two Excel spreadsheets containing just over 25,000 object records, and this is just a segment of their collection. It's not the entire collection. As a matter of fact, they don't even really know how many items they hold because Henry Ford was not very good at keeping records, but they're doing a lot of retrospective description of their objects. Each record for each item contains 18 fields of data. They follow the cataloging cultural object standard in their object descriptions and use a variety of controlled vocabularies, including the Getty's thesaurus of geographic names and their art and architecture thesaurus. They also use the Library of Congress's subject headings and the Library of Congress's thesaurus of graphic materials. And they also use an in-house developed subject list. As is often the case with cataloging, when I asked about their descriptive practices, I was told they are constantly evolving. Data is always dirty, as you're probably all aware. Even in this data set, that was by all accounts perhaps the cleanest data set I have ever examined. There are always variations. Some common ones are plural versus singular entries, qualified entries. So in this data set, there were things like buttons, information artifacts, and buttons fasteners. So what do you do when you have all three of those examples in the data set? There were also problems with granularity in the data. There are a number of items that were marked as photography, but you would also find the narrower entries for things like tintypes, cyanotypes, and daguerreotypes. So before anything could be done, all these variations needed to be tackled in the data. And I'll tell you, it's a very painful and laborious process. So much so that I ended up adding this as the first assignment in the metadata. Refined to prepare a small data set of approximately 100 records. It's an ugly, painful lesson that's best learned early in their careers. With the cleaned and prepared data, in this case, the data concerning the subject headings and the number of times each heading occurs across the data set, we can produce a variety of visualizations. One of the most common ways to visualize a data set is what is known as a tree map. To describe what we're seeing, the visualization is coded using color and size. Those darkest and largest shapes are the most often used applied subject headings, and the smallest and lightest shapes are those that are applied least often. Right away, unexpected themes in the collection holdings appear. While automobiles, automobile racing, and racing cars are expected among the most often occurring subject headings, we also find US presidents, play as in recreation, children, political campaigns, and African Americans. And all of these occurring in the most frequently found subject headings among the top 20 in this data set. Visualizing the subject headings in a different way, we can examine the frequency of the headings. This visualization shows a typical power law distribution of the subject heading occurrences, with a few subject headings being used most often and many subject headings only being used a few times. And this is only for those subject headings that are found at least 10 times in the data set, 10 times or above. Besides getting a sense of the topical content of the collection, the data also allows us to see the temporal breadth of the collection, which says something about the collection history and the kinds of things that interested Henry Ford. The majority of items in the data set date to the period of time when Henry Ford was actively collecting, and so suggest he collected contemporary items. He basically collected from the 19-teens to his death in 1947. Using the place of manufacture associated with the items, we can see the countries represented in the collection. Considering it is a museum of American innovation, it's interesting to see items appearing in the data from many areas beyond the United States borders. If we take this to an even finer grain level, the data shows that the Henry Ford collected primarily items made in Michigan, to be expected, but that a number of collection items were birthed in New York State, among several other states. This visualization shows the various kinds of objects held by the Henry Ford. The size of the bubble indicates the number of items held of that type. And as you can see, photographic prints were the most often encountered object type in this collection data set. And then also I wanted to point out that the list on the left is also ordered according to frequency of object types in the collection. Again, there are things that make perfect sense, such as models, license plates, hubcaps, and automobiles, but others were completely surprising, such as medical bottles, medicine bottles, and electric toasters. And this is one last visualization, a word cloud, too, as simple as they are to create, can help give a sense of a collection. For this one, I merely used all the data in the description field. The predominance of photographic items in the display offers secondary proof to the high number of photographs found in the collection data. So in conclusion, I think these methods offer a great deal of promise for museums, especially useful as a means of helping to engage audiences with museum collections. However, creating the visualizations is laborious, and without easy access to tools, the process becomes even more challenging. And I will note that IBM Many Eyes was used to create many of the visualizations, and it's no longer available online. So one of the tools that was probably the least difficult hurdle to overcome is no longer available. So now I'm going to switch to the second project that I'm going to talk about, and this one examines the publicly available data accompanying items in online collections of art museums in the United States. As everyone in the room is aware, art museums enrich us all in multiple ways. Unfortunately, the wealth of their resources is largely inaccessible to the public due to a multitude of constraints. And thus, it's important for museums to try to extend their reach through online collections. But we also know that they're not very well used when they are found online. There has been research that's shown that. So with this research, I'm trying to get an overarching picture of the presentation of art collections in the online setting. To do this, there are a series of questions to guide the research, and here I present you with a few that pertain closely to the data that I'll present this morning. 51 museums that had some form of online collection were selected from a spreadsheet created in 2015 by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, a governmental agency that funds research, projects, and programs from the GLAM sector in the United States. The data collection instrument consisted of a series of 110 questions examining a variety of aspects concerning the online presence of the museums. An online survey was used to collect the data. In case order displays, content analyses, and descriptive statistics were used to analyze the data. At a basic level, we need to understand how many items are held by each collection so we can determine how representative the online collections are. So the museum reported number of items held was collected. I should note here that several of the museums failed to report the number of items that were held in their collections. Next, we determined how many online item records were present for each museum. While this would seem to be a very straightforward task, it was not. Only 8 museums made the number of items in their online systems explicit, and for the remaining museums, various methods were used to determine this figure. And if you're interested in the details involved in how we did that, you can ask me later. So, from these figures, we can determine the percentage of collection coverage. We discovered that there was a vast range of coverage from less than 1% of their collection to over 100% of their collection. And for those of you who are saying, well, how could that be? Well, that's a really good question. And so several possibilities come to mind. Museums may have underreported the number of items in their collections. There may be multi-part items that have been counted variously, and/or item records were provided in the online system for more than the artworks held in the museum. And in fact, this was found. For example, records about donors, exhibitions, and artists were sometimes included along with object records with no way to weed those records out. The online collections were examined to see how searches were performed, how collections were browsed, whether users were able to interact with the collection items via social media, and finally, what media formats were present in the systems. So in the case of this online collection, in the top left, you can see the keyword function. These are areas that you browse, and then in the top right, there's a link for the advanced search area. All of the museums provided keyword searching. A majority of museums provided pre-selected image sets for browsing. Many different ways to group those items were found across the museums. The ability to perform advanced searches was found in many of the museum's collections. The number of fields that were presented for searching here ranged from a low of 2 fields to a high of 29, with most museums commonly having between 9 to 11 searchable fields, discrete fields. Advanced searches are most often encountered as a text entry action, but these can consist also of sliding selections for, in this case, earliest and latest date ranges. Or as a field you select, which then brings up a controlled list of terms which is tied to that field that you can then select from. And in this case, there are 4 different kind of controlled lists that are associated with those 4 fields. Or, as was sometimes encountered, as a drop-down list of terms that you could select from. And often, you're also able to enter text into specific fields in combination with some or all of the above that I've just shown you. So these variations clearly create a very complex and difficult way to form and to construct and understand what's happening within these systems. Advanced searches using wildcard characters worked in less than half the systems. The character used for this varied and was rarely made explicit within the system. The use of Boolean operators to narrow, broaden, and/or limit searches were also found to be functional in some, but not all of the online collections. To test this, a keyword search was performed for the term portrait, and the retrieved items reviewed and their numbers noted. Then, various keyword searches were performed of terms such as man, woman, and bust, and these were compared to the items retrieved to the portrait search. Several museum collections, 10, about 20%, appeared to have captured all items with the portrait concept within their retrievals. However, the majority of the museums, that's about 80%, failed to recall all of their collection items fitting within the portrait concept. As would be expected, retrievals were based on the term portrait occurring somewhere within the records. Many of the retrievals occurred through the formal descriptive entries and categorizations made by the museum staff. User tags applied by the general public in those few collections that incorporated this feature were also found to play an important role in revealing items that would otherwise not have been retrieved in response to the standard query of portrait put to each system. Ways to share items in the collection via social media were provided by over half the museums, and the chart here identifies the most often encountered social media provisions among the museum's online collections. In some cases, there were like hundreds of options. All of the museums provided representative images for their collections, but only approximately a third of the museums provided images for every object within their item record. Additional media was provided by several museums in the form of online audio and video content. In each case, these files were narratives discussing the object as opposed to surrogates of the objects themselves. As can be seen, media beyond images was not commonly encountered. The display of images by the online collection systems also varied. Some were modestly sized images in the upper corner with no other means of interacting with the images. And then yet other systems would allow you to pan or maybe zoom in onto the details within that modest little imaged area. And yet other systems launched a larger window within which to examine the image in greater detail. In general, the image quality and tools likely were not found to meet the needs of all users of the collection. The number of fields in the various collection item records was found to range between 11 and 29 separate fields of data, with the majority of museums presenting their data within 13 to 17 discrete fields. What would seem to be a basic feature of system design, that is, providing a field name to accompany the data found in an item record, was not as common as would be expected, with some museums providing no labels or only labels for some of the fields. Controlled entry fields were present among the majority of museums. The chart here provides the frequency of the controlled fields found across the 51 museums, with artist creator being the most common. So, collecting and analyzing the online collection data was difficult because so much variation was encountered in the data. The percentage of U.S. art museums that have some portion of their collections online was actually fairly low at about 20%. So any part of their collection online was only found about 20% of the time. The percentage of the holdings presented online ranged from very low to full collection coverage, as we saw. While the descriptive practices indicated professional techniques were being used to describe the collection, the systems used to serve up the data were not very effective. Less than half would allow for wildcard searching, and only 37% used Boolean search logic. User interactions with the online content were provided for social media, for the museums, but only 12% of the museums took advantage of allowing users to apply tags to the items they held. Finally, while all of the museums provided at least some images for items in the collection, the media interactions were limited in terms of functionality and format. That doesn't mean it's all gloom and doom. When the students that I have evaluating these systems as a part of the digital libraries course I teach, they're generally happy with their experiences, even while noting the various shortcomings they may have encountered. It was clear that while they may not have fully understood how the system functioned, they were happy to have access to the items that they were able to retrieve. So in terms of the next steps, the remaining 2/3 of the IMLS spreadsheet still needs to be reviewed and the data collected from those museums identified with the remaining online collections. To gain insight into the museum practices, we hope to discuss and get feedback from collection staff, which is tremendously important. And finally, we hope to perform a usability study of the online collections in the future. So that's it. Thank you very much.